The sun hung low over the Wyoming plains, bleeding its last light across miles of dry grass and stubborn sage. A hawk circled once above the barn, silent except for faint whine of wind to the cedar posts. The ranch lay still, too still for a man used to loneliness. He'd swept the porch twice already. Not that it needed it. Just something to keep his hands busy while the clock ticked louder in his chest. The rancher, name of Eli Ward, hadn't felt this kind of nervousness since his first cattle auction. He'd shaved that morning, something he rarely did, and the skin along his jaw was still raw from the effort. Beside him on the steps sat a bouquet of wildflowers, purple lupin and faded white prairie clover. He'd picked them at dawn, when the sky was still soft and pink, thinking they might brighten her mood after the long road west. His bride. The word still felt foreign, delicate, like something borrowed and breakable. For 6 months, Eli had written her letters. Slow, careful ones, inked by lamplight when the wolves howled far off. Her name was Clara, and her words had carried warmth he hadn't known in years. She'd written about the sea, about her little town back east, and about wanting to start again somewhere quiet. He'd told her about the wind, the soil, the horses, about the kind of life that didn't come easy but could still be honest. Now, every creak in the windmill made him straighten and look down the trail. The stage was late. He checked his pocket watch again. The chain trembled slightly in his hand. 2 years ago, he'd buried his father on this land, and since then, silence had been his only company. He'd told himself he didn't need anyone. Then her letters had come, and for the first time in a long while, Eli had dared to picture laughter echoing through the house again. At last, in the far distance, dust rose like a small storm. He felt his breath catch. The stagecoach, a flicker of movement between sun and earth. His fingers tightened around the bouquet. He stood, straightened his collar, wiped his palms against his jeans. Finally, he murmured. The sound of hooves grew louder, joined by the faint rattle of wheels. The coach came over the rise, sunlight flashing off the driver's brass buckle. Eli's heart thumped with the rhythm of each turning wheel. He'd imagined this moment 100 ways. How she'd smile, maybe shy, maybe relieved. How he'd help her down. Say something simple but right. The stage pulled to a stop in front of the porch, the horses snorting and stamping dust. Eli stepped forward, flowers trembling in his hand. The driver tipped his hat, but didn't speak. The door creaked open, and the world seemed to pause. A figure stepped out, a woman. Gray hair pulled back under a faded bonnet, her frame broad, shoulders strong from work. She wasn't the 20-something he'd written to, not the young voice from the letters. Her eyes, however, steady, blue, deeply human, met his without flinching. For a moment, Eli couldn't speak. His throat closed around the words that were supposed to come. The flowers sagged in his grip. The woman set her gloved hands on her skirt, glanced at the driver, then at Eli. "I'm Clara," she said quietly. Her voice was rough, worn by wind and distance. Or rather, I'm who's come in her place. The driver shifted his weight, spat into the dust, and muttered something about making the next town by nightfall. Then he climbed back to the reins and drove off, leaving the rancher and the woman in a cloud of yellow dust. Eli stood still, the silence ringing louder than thunder. "I think there's been a mistake," he said at last, his voice slow, heavy. "I know who you wrote to," she interrupted gently. "She was my daughter." The words hit him like a kick to the ribs. She looked down, twisting the hem of her shawl. "She took sick not long after your last letter. Before she passed, she made me promise I'd come. Said you'd be waiting, and that maybe you didn't deserve to be left alone, either." The wind caught the edge of her bonnet, lifting it just enough to show deep lines at the corners of her mouth. Lines carved by more than years. She waited, shoulders squared, like she expected him to send her away. Eli's jaw worked. He looked at the empty trail behind her, then at the house that suddenly felt too small for this moment. He wanted to say something, anything, but all he managed was, "You came all this way for a promise?" She nodded once. Didn't sit right, letting a man wait on ghosts. The words settled heavy between them. The air smelled of dust and pine. Eli finally lowered the flowers, their stems bent from his grip. "I don't know what to do," he said simply. "Maybe just start with supper." She answered, not smiling but not cold either. He hesitated, then bent to pick up her worn trunk. It was heavier than it looked. As he carried it inside, the house seemed to hold its breath. Chairs pushed in, dishes stacked, one plate already set on the table, waiting for someone who no longer existed. She followed him in, stepped slow, her eyes taking in everything. When she spoke, it was with quiet resolve. "I can cook, and mend if you've got things that need mending." He set her trunk down by the wall. "You don't owe me any work, ma'am," he said, voice tight. "Maybe not," she replied, "but neither of us owes the silence anything either." Eli stood there, hat in hand, feeling something inside him shift, something he couldn't name yet. Outside, the last of the sunlight faded behind the hills. Inside, the woman lit a small oil lamp. Its glow touched the walls, soft and gold. The smell of kerosene and damp will fill the cabin that first night. Rain began to fall, slow, steady, soft enough to hear each drop find the roof. Eli Ward sat by the hearth, boot heel tapping against the floorboards, eyes on a flickering flame. The woman, Mrs. Clara Hale, as she'd later tell him, moved quietly in the small kitchen space, her every motion measured, practiced. She'd insisted on cooking, despite the hour and the long road behind her. Eli hadn't argued, maybe because he didn't know what else to say, maybe because it had been too long since the smell of real food filled that room. He'd expected a wife. What he got was a stranger who moved through his house like she already knew where everything belonged. When the stew was ready, she set a single bowl on the table and nodded toward him. "Eat while it's warm," she said. He hesitated. "I'm not much hungry." She glanced up, one brow raised. "Then eat till you are." Her tone wasn't harsh. It was simply certain. He obeyed without knowing why. The first spoonful burned his tongue, but the warmth spread quick through his chest, chasing off the cold that had settled there since the moment she stepped off that wagon. They didn't talk much, only the clink of metal on the bowl, the hiss of rain on the chimney. But when she reached for her cup, Eli noticed her hands, thick-fingered, scarred, steady as oak. They weren't delicate like he'd imagined his bride's would be, but something in their strength steadied him all the same. After supper, she cleaned the dishes, found a broom without asking, swept as though the place already belonged to her. Eli stood awkwardly by the door, hat still in hand, watching her move through his world like she was mending it just by being there. "There's only one bed," he said finally, voice low. "I'll take the chair by the fire." She didn't argue, just nodded, eyes soft. "That'll do." By morning, the storm had passed. Mist lay heavy across the fields, the kind that made distance seem like memory. Eli stepped outside, breath fogging in the cool dawn. He thought about sending her away, about offering money, a wagon, anything to make this mistake disappear. But when he turned back toward the cabin, he saw her standing at the window, drying the same cup he'd used the night before. There was a gentleness to it, something that made the house look alive again. He found himself unable to say the words. That day, she followed him out to corral. She didn't stay inside sewing or reading like the women in his imagination. She rolled up her sleeves and got to work. "You ever worked horses?" he asked, half smiling. She gave a small snort. "I've worked men worse than them." By noon, she'd earned his respect. When a skittish mare snapped a rope and cut its leg on a nail, she moved quick, tore her apron, cleaned the wound, whispered calm until the animal stopped shaking. Eli just stood there, rain-spattered hat in hand, watching. "You'd done this before," he said. "Had a husband who wouldn't let me sit idle," she replied, eyes far away. "Wasn't much of a man, but he taught me to keep things breathing." He wanted to ask more, but she'd already turned back to the fence. Shoulders set, story closed. That evening, they shared coffee by the fire. Outside, the coyotes sang to the moon. She told him about her daughter, the real Clara, a girl with a laugh like wind chimes in summer. The sickness had come sudden, cruel. By the time the letter from Eli arrived, the girl was already gone. She kept it on her nightstand. The older woman said quietly, said maybe there was still kindness somewhere west of the river. When she passed, I couldn't bear the thought of you standing at that road, waiting on nobody. Eli's hands tightened around his mug. You didn't owe me that. I know, but maybe I owed her one last good deed. The silence that followed wasn't heavy this time. It was full, like the quiet between two people who finally said enough. When the wind picked up, rattling the windows, Eli rose to check the barn. Rain was starting again, a hard, drumming rain that made the earth tremble. He pulled on his coat, but before he could step out, she grabbed her shawl and followed. Stay inside, he said. No need for her. But she was already outside, skirts whipping the wind, heading toward the chicken pen. The storm had thrown the latch. The hens were scattering into the mud. Without hesitation, she plunged into the chaos, arms wide, gathering them one by one. Lightning cracked across the sky. Eli cursed under his breath, ran to help. Mud clung to his boots, cold water soaking through. When he reached her, she was laughing, actually laughing, as a hen pecked at her sleeve. You'll catch your death, he shouted over the wind. Better than losing theirs, she called back, eyes shining. By the time they got the last of the chickens inside, both were soaked to the bone. They stumbled into the barn, dripping, breathless. For a moment, neither spoke. Only the rain spoke for them, pounding on the tin roof, softening the air between heartbeats. Eli looked at her, hair clinging to her face, dress plastered with mud, and something in his chest loosened. She wasn't what he'd asked for, but maybe she was what the land had decided he needed. He reached for her arm. You didn't have to help. She looked up at him, eyes bright through the shadow. Neither did you. The words echoed in the quiet that followed, the same ones she'd said that first night, the same ones that now meant something else entirely. Eli found himself smiling, a small, tired smile he hadn't felt in years. Guess we both did anyhow. She nodded once, simple and sure. That's what folks do when they've both been left behind. That night, as they dried by the fire, Eli watched her mend the torn sleeve of his coat. Her needle moved slow, careful. The firelight caught the edge of her hair, turning silver to gold. He wanted to say thank you, but the words felt too small. So instead, he just sat there, listening to the rain ease, the horses settling, the sound of her hum filling the room like a prayer that didn't need words. And for the first time since he could remember, Eli didn't dread the silence. He listened, because now the house wasn't empty anymore. Winter came early that year. Frost kissed the window glass before dawn, and the old oak by the corral stood silver with ice. Eli Ward rose before first light, as always, and found the house already awake. A thin curl of smoke drifted from the chimney. Inside, Mrs. Hale was at the stove, humming softly, stirring oats with one hand and rubbing her shoulder with the other. She'd been living there nearly 3 months. The place looked different now, not new but alive. Curtains at the window, boots lined neatly by the door, herbs hanging to dry by the rafters. Eli had never asked to stay, and she'd never asked to leave. Somehow, they'd both just remained. He stood at the doorway, hat in hand. You don't have to do all that, he said, same as he said every morning. She gave him the same answer she always did. Then it's a good thing I ain't a skin permission. He smiled quietly, sat at the table. She poured his coffee without asking how he liked it. By now, she knew. Outside, the ranch breathed, horses nickering, a rooster calling to the pale light. The loneliness that used to sit heavy in his chest had shifted into something warmer, steadier. She'd done that, not through words, but through presence. As they ate, Eli found himself looking at her hands again, those same hands that Stitch cooked, sewed, worked beside his. He realized he couldn't imagine the place without them now. When she caught him staring, she chuckled. Something wrong with my face? He looked down, embarrassed. Just thinking how quiet it used to be here. Quiet's good, she said, but not when it's hollow. Her words lingered as he pulled on his coat and headed out to fix a broken fence. She followed, bringing a bucket of feed. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. That afternoon, a wagon rolled up the trail. One Eli didn't expect. A young woman stepped down, tall, clean-faced, with a polished look of someone who hadn't worked the land a day in her life. The driver called out cheerfully, "Message from town. Says you were looking for a wife once upon a time. This one here's answering that old post." Eli froze. He'd forgotten all about the advertisement he'd put out before the first letters with Clara. The young woman smiled, bright and certain. "I heard you're a decent man with land and work to share," she said. "Figured I'd see for myself." Mrs. Hale stood in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron, face unreadable. Eli felt the old ache of confusion return, that tangle of duty, expectation, and memory. The younger woman was everything he'd once thought he wanted, the kind of wife who might have looked right beside him at Sunday service. She talked fast, eyes darting around the ranch like she was already placing herself in it. "You've got good soil here," she said. "I could help run things. Cook, maybe." Mrs. Hale turned back inside quietly. No protest, no pleading. Just a silence. That same silence Eli had learned to read by now. He looked at the young woman again, saw how her shoes sank in the mud, how she kept glancing at the horizon like she'd rather be anywhere else. He thought of the letters, of the loss behind them, of the woman who'd stepped off that wagon when she didn't have to. And for the first time, Eli understood something simple. Love wasn't in what you asked for. It was in who stayed. He lifted his hat politely. "Ma'am," he said to the newcomer, "you came a long way, but I'm not the man that ad was written for anymore." The girl blinked, confused. "I don't understand." "You don't have to," he said gently, "but thank you all the same." The driver shifted, uneasy, then turned the wagon around. The young woman left without another word. Dust rose, then settled back into stillness. Eli stood a long while in that quiet, hat in hand. Then he turned toward the house. Inside, Mrs. Hale was sitting by the fire, mending his glove. She didn't look up. "You could have had her," she said simply. "I could have," he agreed. Silence again. Then, softly, she asked, "Why didn't you?" Eli stepped closer, the fire's glow catching the lines of his face. Older now, but steadier, surer. He knelt beside her chair. "Because the woman I waited for came the day that wagon stopped," he said. Her hands went still. Slowly, she set the glove aside and met his eyes. The disbelief there wasn't from doubt. It was from a heart long and used to being chosen. "You don't mean that," she whispered. "I do," he said. "You came for kindness, but you brought more than that. You brought the world back in with you." Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. She turned away, pressing her sleeve to her cheek. "You don't know what you're saying, Eli." He smiled faintly. "I know enough. I know this house ain't hollow anymore." He reached for her hand, rough meeting rough, callous against callous. She didn't pull away. At dawn the next morning, the frost was gone. The earth steamed softly as sunlight stretched across the plains. Eli and Mrs. Hale sat side by side on the porch steps, coffee in hand, watching the horses wander the pasture. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't empty now. It was full of all the words they'd already lived. A flock of geese passed overhead, the sound low and mournful. Mrs. Hale followed them with her eyes, then smiled faintly. "Never thought I'd see a place like this twice in one life." "You won't have to leave it again," he said. She looked at him, not with surprise, but with quiet peace. "You sure about that, Eli Ward?" He nodded. "Sure as I am about the sunrise." She leaned back, sighing softly. "Then I reckon your bride finally came after all." He smiled. "Took the long road, that's all." The camera would pull back, now, wide shot over the ranch. The sun rising behind them, two figures framed against a golden plain. The wind moves gently through the grass. The house, once hollow, now alive with the scent of bread. The sound of laughter waiting to return. And a voice, low and calm, would close the story. Some promises keep us waiting. But sometimes the right heart shows up wearing a different face and stays long enough to make the waiting worth it.